Please subscribe to my channel. This is my sincere request to you. My brother's text was short but freezing. I wasn't a good fit for the engagement party. I had quietly saved from ruin. What he didn't realize was that I held every vendor contract, and I saw my forged signature on his hidden liabilities. 3 days later, I boarded a flight to Hawaii with one suitcase and a lethal silence. When my phone exploded in Oahu, it wasn't just about a ruined party, but a family deception unraveling. My name is Claire Robinson. I am 34 years old, and I am a woman who believes in the absolute power of a well-drafted contract. As a senior contracts manager at North Briar Development Group in Charlotte, my daily life revolves around mitigating risk, anticipating disasters, and ensuring that every single term is explicitly defined. I protect corporate clients from ruin my family. However, I perform this exact same service for free and usually without acknowledgement. For as long as I can remember, I have been the designated crisis manager and the silent janitor for the Robinson family. If a utility bill is missed, if a poorly advised lease needs breaking, or if an impulsive financial decision requires immediate undoing, I am the one who receives the panicked phone call. I am the fixer. When my brother was 22, I navigated the settlement of his defaulted credit cards. When he was 25, I legally extracted him from a disastrous partnership. I handled the paperwork, the mounting costs, and the inevitable fallout better than anyone else in my bloodline. For the past 6 weeks, I had been quietly working behind the scenes to orchestrate a lavish engagement party for that very same older brother, Owen Robinson. The event was set to take place in Charleston, South Carolina, a city widely known for its breathtaking antebellum venues and equally exorbitant price tags. Event planning is certainly not my actual profession, but Owen needed a miracle, and miracles usually require relentless negotiation. He had incredibly grand dreams to impress his new in-laws, coupled with a remarkably thin wallet that could not support those ambitions. Through sheer determination, I leveraged my corporate network, called in personal favors from hospitality vendors, and utilized every ounce of my negotiation skills. I secured a historic waterfront estate, a top-tier culinary team, and a highly sought-after floral design studio, all at a fraction of their standard market rates. I brought a $50,000 initial estimate down to something manageable. I engineered a financial masterpiece that allowed Owen to look like a wildly successful entrepreneur without actually having to be one. I spent countless late nights reviewing catering addendums, coordinating complex delivery schedules, and ensuring every logistical detail was flawless. I did all of this quietly, expecting nothing more than a brief note of gratitude and a polite toast at the event I had single-handedly salvaged. It happened on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my desk deep into a commercial lease review when my phone illuminated with an incoming message. It was from Owen. The message was not particularly long, but the words carried a sudden biting chill that seemed to suck all the warmth out of my corner office. He wrote that after careful consideration, he and his fiancée felt that my presence at the upcoming party was not a good fit. He claimed that the bride's side of the family was aiming for a more refined vibe, and they needed to curate the guest list carefully to reflect that specific elevated aesthetic. I stopped breathing for a full 10 seconds. I just sat there reading the glowing blue text bubbles over and over again, trying to process the syntax. I was stunned by the sheer, unadulterated bluntness of it. There was no softening of the blow. There was no attempt to thank me for the dozens of hours I had poured into saving his event. There was no polite excuse about venue capacity limits or a sudden change in fire codes. He just casually pushed me out, discarding me like a redundant, inconvenient clause in a rough draft. It was a mundane, deeply ordinary kind of humiliation delivered via a casual text message in the exact middle of a busy workday. My first instinct was to seek a voice of reason, someone to validate the sheer insanity of this rejection. I picked up my phone and dialed our mother, Elaine Robinson. I naively hoped that at the very least she would see the profound absurdity of the situation. I expected her to be shocked, or perhaps to offer to talk some sense into her golden boy before he made a massive mistake. Instead, Her tone was entirely dismissive, laced with that familiar, weary annoyance she always reserved for me. When I read her the text word for word, she sighed heavily into the receiver. She told me I needed to be mature about this situation. She insisted that I should not take it personally, claiming that weddings make people tense, and then she actively begged me not to cause a dramatic scene and ruin my brother's big day. According to Elaine, I was the strong one, the sensible one, the independent woman who could handle anything. In her twisted logic, this meant I was the one expected to swallow my pride, absorb the insult, and disappear quietly so Owen could shine. I ended the call with my mother without saying goodbye, and immediately dialed Owen. He picked up on the third ring, his voice already pitching upward, sounding incredibly defensive before I even managed to speak a single word. I demanded an actual logical explanation. Under the intense pressure of my direct, unwavering questioning, his fragile facade crumbled almost instantly. He stammered and finally admitted that his fiancée, Sloane Whittaker, was the one who explicitly did not want me in the official professionally shot photographs. Sloane, who hailed from old coastal money and guarded her carefully constructed social image with a vicious, relentless intensity, had decreed that I was too stiff, too serious, and simply did not fit in with the bridal party's effortlessly chic, light-hearted vibe. I was not photogenic enough for her perfectly curated social media narrative. I was apparently good enough to grind down aggressive vendors, review liability insurance, and slash catering costs by 40%. But I was fundamentally not aesthetically pleasing enough to stand in the blurred background of their celebration. My chest tightened painfully, a heavy knot of betrayal forming in my throat, but years of high-stakes corporate negotiations had taught me exactly how to keep my voice perfectly level. I told Owen I understood his position clearly, hung up the phone with a quiet click, and turned my attention back to my glowing computer monitor. I needed to ground myself immediately. I needed concrete facts, not messy feelings. Automatically, muscle memory taking over, my fingers navigated to the shared cloud folder where I kept all the event contracts and financial spreadsheets. I opened the master vendor file, fully intending to mentally and digitally wash my hands of the entire miserable affair. As I scrolled quickly through the file catering and venue agreements, ready to close out the tabs, a specific line of text caught my eye and brought my racing angry thoughts to a violent, grinding halt. It was an addendum for an upgraded luxury lounge package and a premium bar service. I did not remember authorizing either of these expensive additions. I scrolled down rapidly to the signature block at the bottom of the page. There a heavily bolded section, labeled Secondary Guarantor, was my full legal name. Beside it was a digital signature stamp that I absolutely unequivocally did not authorize or place there. I zoomed in on the document. The metadata felt wrong just looking at it. They had not just uninvited me from the party. They had brazenly forged my consent to personally underwrite their sudden, unearned extravagance. I did not cry. I did not scream at the monitor. I did not throw my phone across the office or draft a furious, emotionally unhinged email demanding immediate answers from my brother. Instead, I leaned back slowly in my ergonomic desk chair, crossed my arms tightly over my chest, and let out a long, slow breath. I sat in absolute chilling silence, staring unblinking at the bright screen for a very long time. It was the exact undeniable moment my lifelong familial loyalty completely evaporated, instantly replaced by the cold, calculating, and ruthless clarity of a senior contracts manager who had just discovered a massive fraudulent material breach. The silence in my office was deafening. It was the first undeniable sign that I was not going to react to this betrayal or play the role of the quiet, endlessly compliant sister they all expected me to be. To understand how I arrived at this exact moment of silent, calculating clarity, you have to understand the foundational architecture of the Robinson family. For over a decade, I had been the load-bearing pillar holding up a house built entirely on my brother's delusions. It started small and early. When Owen was 22 years old, he walked into a dealership and financed a luxury sedan he absolutely could not afford on a part-time barrister's salary. I was the one who co-signed the auto loan, foolishly believing his grandiose promises of an impending lucrative promotion. 9 months later, I was the one working 60-hour weeks at my first demanding corporate job just to cover his missed payments, so my own pristine credit score would not be obliterated. Then came the trendy loft apartment in his mid-twenties. $3,200 for the initial security deposit handed over directly from my meager savings account because he claimed he had a massive business opportunity that absolutely required him to live in the downtown financial district. The business venture failed spectacularly within 4 months. The lease was broken. I absorbed the heavy financial hit in complete silence. My parents, Reed and Elaine, never viewed this dynamic as exploitation. In their eyes, Owen was a misunderstood visionary who was simply temporarily down on his luck. He possessed a dangerous, undeniable charisma. He could walk into a crowded room and make every single person feel like they were the most fascinating individual on earth. He had the golden hair, the easy, infectious laugh, and the absolute, unwavering certainty that he was destined for immense greatness because he looked and played the part so well. My parents endlessly subsidized his alternate reality. I, on the other hand, was competent. I was grounded in facts and figures. I did not require rescuing, which in my family's deeply twisted logic meant I did not require protection, advocacy, or gratitude. My capability was my curse. The better I became at managing complex corporate crises at work, the more personal disasters they pile onto my plate at home, entirely taking for granted that I would simply chew through the mess without a single word of complaint. This toxic family dynamic metastasized rapidly the moment Owen decided to marry Sloane Whitaker. The Whiters were a completely different breed of wealth. They were old South Carolina coastal money, the exact kind of people who belonged to exclusive yacht clubs established in the late 1800s and communicated entirely through layers of passive-aggressive weaponized hospitality. For Sloane and her parents, public image was not just important, it was a religion. They judged a person's worth exclusively by their pedigree, their zip code, and their ability to effortlessly host a formal garden party for 200 affluent guests. Owen was completely intoxicated by their world, and he was terrified they would discover he was just a middle-class guy with a long, hidden history of failed startups and bailed-out debts. Sloane quickly realized my utilitarian value. She was more than happy to let me toil away in the shadows, leveraging my professional corporate network to secure impossible, heavily discounted vendor rates. But there was a hard, impenetrable wall between the grueling labor and the luxurious celebration. While I was spending my precious weekends aggressively fighting with caterers over the specific price per head of wild-caught salmon, Sloane was hosting intimate, highly curated aesthetic planning sessions that I was explicitly barred from attending. I was deliberately never added to the bridal party group chats. I found out about the private vintage champagne tastings and the monogrammed gift selection brunches through stylized social media posts. I was not invited to the exclusive seating chart luncheon. I was treated exactly like a slightly embarrassing, overly aggressive contractor who had been hired off the street completely invisible until a deposit needed to be aggressively lowered or an airtight liability contract needed to be drafted. The exclusion was deeply painful, but the blatant theft of my intellectual property was what truly began to harden my heart. I had spent over 40 hours developing a cohesive design language for the party to maximize the venue's natural architecture while hiding its logistical flaws. I personally drafted a complex blueprint for a cascading floral entrance to mask the ugly loading dock. I created a custom amber lighting scheme to make the cavernous ballroom feel intimate and warm. I even designed and tested the bespoke recipes for the signature cocktails. Yet, during a family dinner just a month prior, I sat in stone-cold silence as my cousin Mallory Keene eagerly pulled up a digital presentation board on her tablet and claimed my exact lighting and floral concepts as her own brilliant inspiration. Sloane had beamed at her across the table, loudly praising Mallory's unparalleled eye for high-end luxury design. They literally took my blueprints, erased my name from the headers, and patted each other on the back for their incredible inherited taste. I had tried to stop the bleeding once. I had called my father, Reed, hoping he would finally step in and demand some basic respect for his daughter. I laid out the facts of how I was being used. Instead, his voice dropped to an urgent, hushed whisper, treating my valid frustration like a massive, inappropriate inconvenience. He explicitly told me to lower my voice and stop being so sensitive. He stated that Owen was finally securing his permanent future, and that making a fuss over credit for some light bulbs and flowers would make me look incredibly bitter and jealous. He strictly instructed me to swallow my pride, keep my head down, and play my part, because a family divided would look incredibly bad in front of the powerful Whittakers. He essentially ordered me to be a silent doormat so my brother could walk with clean shoes into high society. That deeply humiliating conversation echoed in my mind as I sat frozen in my office, my eyes burning from the glare of the financial spreadsheet. The forged signature on the luxury lounge addendum was the initial spark, but I was suddenly realizing the entire house was soaked in gasoline. I tore my eyes away from the fraudulent secondary guarantor line and started hunting aggressively through the master ledger. If they were brazen enough to fake my legal approval on one document, the rod had to go much deeper. I meticulously compared the initial approved baseline budget against a finalized payment schedule. It took me exactly 14 minutes to find the massive anomaly buried on page 4 of the vendor disbursements. Nestled quietly between the high-end valet service and the boutique linen rentals was a line item I had never seen before in my life. The pay was listed as Ivory Lantern Studio. The service description simply reads supplemental design and coordination. The amount owed was $22,500. I stopped breathing. I knew every single vendor in a 50-mile radius. I had personally vetted every florist, every draping company, and every rental house. There was absolutely no such entity as Ivory Lantern Studio in our approved ecosystem. There was no preliminary contract, no scope of work, no tax identification number, and no contact email. It was just a massive gaping hole in the budget that had been stealthily added in the last 10 days. I leaned closer to the monitor, the cold glow illuminating the sharp, rigid angles of my face. The scattered puzzle pieces were suddenly snapping together with a terrifying mechanical precision. Sloane's sudden, irrational insistence on keeping me away from the final venue walkthroughs. Owen's brutal text message abruptly kicking me out of the party. It wasn't just because I was supposedly too stiff for the candid photographs. It wasn't just because I didn't effortlessly fit their curated coastal money aesthetic. That was merely the convenient, cruel excuse they fed me to keep me docile. You do not uninvite your lead logistical coordinator on the absolute eve of a massive event unless you are desperately trying to hide the financial reality of what you have built. They didn't just want me out of the family pictures. They wanted me physically removed from the premises so I wouldn't uncover the paper trail. The social exclusion was not just a mean-spirited, elitist insult. It was a calculated, desperate firewall. And as I stared at the phantom invoice for $22,500, I realized they had built that firewall using my own forged signature, fully intending to leave me trapped inside when the building burned down. Barely 24 hours had passed since my brother formally exiled me from his social calendar when my cell phone vibrated violently against the mahogany surface of my desk. The caller ID flashed my father's name, Reed, for a brief, agonizingly naive second. I genuinely thought he was calling to intervene. I thought he was calling to offer a belated apology, or at the very least, an acknowledgement of Owen's spectacular, unprovoked cruelty. I answered the phone, bracing myself for a difficult but necessary conversation about familial respect. Instead, Reed bypassed a standard greeting entirely. He cleared his throat, a sharp, abrasive sound, and launched immediately into business. He told me they were finalizing the last-minute gift registry and the family financial contributions. His voice was brisk, carrying the tone of a project manager delegating a minor task. He said he and my mother had discussed it, and they had put me down for a flat $5,000 as a quote-worthy engagement gift. I pressed the phone harder against my ear, staring blindly at the spreadsheet on my monitor, genuinely wondering if I was experiencing some sort of stress-induced auditory hallucination. I slowly reminded him, keeping my voice dangerously low and precisely articulated, that I had already spent the last month and a half working a second, entirely unpaid job for this exact wedding. I reminded him that I had personally fronted over $3,000 in early administrative deposit fees from my own private checking account to secure the waterfront venue when Owen's credit card was mysteriously declined at the final hour. I had put my own professional reputation on the line with high-tier corporate vendors to secure them at a steep discount. My father did not care about my labor. He dismissed my words with an irritated scoff. He stated that those were just basic logistical favors, things an older sister should naturally do without keeping a petty ledger. This new request, he insisted, was the actual formal gift. When I firmly, unequivocally told him absolutely not, the entire temperature of the phone call dropped to freezing. The pseudo-fatherly tone vanished in an instant, replaced by the harsh, demanding voice of a man who was used to getting his way through sheer intimidation. He snapped that this was a fundamental family duty. He told me that Sloane's parents were paying for the bulk of the high-end catering, and if I did not step up right now to make the Robinson side look respectable and financially solvent, I would be intentionally humiliating my brother in front of crucial people. He did not pause to let me speak. He drove the knife in deeper, delivering a flat, ruthless ultimatum. He said if I chose to be selfish, if I chose to hold a petty grudge over not being invited to a party and consequently made Owen lose face, I should not expect a warm welcome at Thanksgiving, Christmas, or any family gathering for the foreseeable future. He told me I was entirely responsible for the family social standing. Then he hung up the phone. The line went dead before I could even draw a breath to defend myself. I dropped my phone onto my desk. My hands were visibly shaking. It was not from sorrow, and it was not from a sense of rejection. It was from a sudden blinding white-hot rage that made the edges of my vision blur to stop myself from physically sweeping my dual monitors off the desk and shattering them on the floor. I blindly picked up my phone again and opened a social media app, meeting a mindless distraction. The universe, it seemed, had a very sick, twisted sense of humor. The very first item that populated on my feed was a temporary video story posted by my younger cousin, Mallory. The video showed Mallory panning her camera across a lush, heavily draped staging area in a Charleston courtyard. Workers were actively rolling in massive oak barrels and constructing a sprawling multi-level cocktail bar. The text caption floating brightly across the middle of the screen read, "A massive shout out to the incredible generosity of my amazing cousin Claire for officially sponsoring the top-tier premium bar and the fleet of VIP luxury shuttles. We literally could not do this without you. Can't wait for Saturday." My blood ran completely cold. The air left my lungs in a sharp rush. I had aggressively, explicitly vetoed both the premium bar upgrade and the VIP luxury shuttles exactly 3 weeks ago. I had vetoed them because they added almost $9,000 to the event's bottom line, which was money I knew, for an absolute fact, Owen did not possess. I had killed those contracts myself. I certainly had never, at any point, agreed to sponsor them out of my own pocket. I did not reply to Mallory's post. I did not call my father back to scream at him. I slammed my office door shut, locked it, and immediately opened the shared cloud directory containing the master event files. I bypassed the front-facing, heavily manicured budget spreadsheets that Sloane had been decorating with pastel colors. I dug directly into the raw, unedited PDF contracts hidden in the subfolders. I started cross-referencing the document version histories against the exact date and timestamp of Owen's text message telling me I was uninvited. The digital timeline laid out a story so brazen, so meticulously predatory, it made me physically nauseous. The final legally binding addendums for the premium bar service and the luxury transportation had been uploaded, signed, and finalized a mere 4 hours after Owen told me I was not a good fit for the refined aesthetic of the party. They kicked me out the door, locked it behind me, and then immediately went on a massive shopping spree using my name as the credit line. I needed an objective, surgically precise perspective. I could not rely on my own eyes, which were currently clouded by a decade of familial gaslighting. I bundled the 6 most recent contracts, the forged guarantor addendum I had found earlier, and the complete version history logs into a secure encrypted zip file. I emailed them directly to my best friend, Naomi Mercer. Naomi is a senior internal auditor for a massive multinational logistics firm. We met in a postgraduate finance seminar, and she is the only person I know whose emotional baseline is colder and far more pragmatic than mine. She does not care about feelings. She looks at data the way a forensic pathologist looks at a crime scene. I called her the exact second the email showed as delivered on my screen. I told her I needed a blind, ruthless audit of the signatures and the document metadata. I did not give her the messy family drama context. I did not tell her I was crying on the inside. I just gave her the files and asked for the raw facts. She put me on speakerphone for 8 agonizing minutes. The only sound coming through the receiver was the rapid rhythmic clicking of her mouse and her occasional low calculating hum. Finally, the clicking stopped and she rendered her professional verdict. She told me in a voice completely devoid of inflection that the digital signature on the 3 newest addendums was a crude, pathetic copy-paste job. She explained that the pixel compression rate on the signature stamp was entirely inconsistent with the high-resolution PDF document it was resting on. The digital artifact surrounding the ink clearly showed it had been lifted from somewhere else. Furthermore, she stated that whoever had orchestrated this amateur forgery had failed to scrub the origin tags from the metadata. The data clearly showed that the signature block was extracted directly from a joint tax liability document I had signed for my parents exactly 2 years prior. Naomi stated clearly that my family had gone into an old archive, cut my legal signature out of a completed document, and pasted it onto nearly $20,000 worth of new debt. She asked me very calmly if I wanted the direct phone number of a good corporate fraud attorney or if I preferred to drive straight to a police precinct. I thanked Naomi quietly and ended the call. I set the phone face down on the wood grain of my desk. The sheer scale of the betrayal finally crystallized in my mind. They did not just want to exclude me from a party because I lacked the correct social aesthetic. They kept me off the guest list so I would not be physically present to intercept the vendors, review the final manifests, or realize I was footing the entire bill for a lifestyle they could not afford. They wanted my name securely fastened to the financial liability. They needed me to act as a silent, invisible human shield against the inevitable mountain of debt they were rapidly constructing while simultaneously banishing the actual human being attached to that name. So I could not interfere. A strange, profound calm washed over me, starting from the crown of my head and settling heavily into my chest. The burning anger evaporated completely. It left behind a glacial, absolute, and razor-sharp focus. There would be no more pleading for basic decency. There would be no more desperate, tearful phone calls demanding to know why I was not loved or respected enough by my own blood. You do not argue morality with people who view you as an open, unlimited, and highly exploitable line of credit. You simply close the account. I opened a blank secured digital vault on my desktop. I began systematically saving every file, every manipulated timestamp, and every piece of corrupted metadata Naomi had highlighted. I backed it up to 2 separate offline drives. I was no longer the discarded, unappreciated sister throwing a quiet pity party in her office. I had shifted entirely. I was now a senior contracts manager preparing a bulletproof, legally devastating dossier. It was almost midnight when I finally pushed through the glass doors of a 24-hour diner located on the quiet edge of the business district. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, a harsh but welcome contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of my office. Naomi was already sitting in a corner booth, nursing a mug of dark roast and reviewing a quarterly earnings report on her tablet. I slid into the cracked vinyl seat across from her and placed my laptop on the table. I did not need to cry and I did not need to vent. I needed a strategy, and Naomi was the best tactical mind I knew. She looked up, taking in my rigid posture and the absolute lack of emotion on my face. She closed her tablet and folded her hands. She told me that the most critical thing I had to do right now was maintain total unbreakable composure. She warned me that if I called my parents, screaming, or if I sent Owen a furious, emotionally charged message, they would instantly weaponize my reaction. They would paint me as the unstable, jealous sister who was trying to sabotage a beautiful wedding out of pure spite. Naomi leaned forward and instructed me to treat this exactly like a hostile corporate divorce. She said I did not need to threaten them, and I certainly did not need to explain myself. I just needed to execute a clean, documented, and legally bulletproof exit procedure. I ordered a black coffee from a passing waitress, opened my laptop, and connected to the diner's unsecured wireless network. I opened a new message window and began to type. I drafted a single unified email address to every major vendor involved in the engagement party. The recipient list included the catering director, the audiovisual team lead, the luxury transportation dispatcher, and the venue management staff. I wrote the message with the cold, sterile precision of a legal notice. I did not include a single word about my toxic family dynamic. I did not mention that my brother had cowardly uninvited me via text message, nor did I mention the staggering disrespect for my mother. I simply stated that effective immediately, I was permanently stepping down as the primary point of contact and lead coordinator for the Robinson event. I added a second heavily bolded paragraph stating clearly that any requested upgrades, federal modifications, or financial guarantees bearing my name from this specific date forward were completely null and void unless they were accompanied by my direct verbal confirmation over a recorded phone line. I concluded the email by providing Owen's personal cell phone number and his email address, instructing them to direct all future invoices and logistical inquiries directly to the groom. I hit send. Then I sat back and watched the steam rise from my coffee mug. I did not have to wait long for the fallout to begin. Exactly 4 minutes later, a notification chimed on my screen. It was a direct reply from Gavin Hall, the senior events director at the waterfront venue. Gavin was a meticulous professional who practically lived in his inbox, and my sudden withdrawal clearly triggered his internal risk management alarms. His email was polite, but laced with thinly veiled panic. He asked for immediate clarification because just 2 hours prior, Owen had called the venue directly to request the addition of a premium late-night cigar lounge and a massive display of pyrotechnic garden sparklers for the grand exit. Gavin noted that when he had informed Owen of the steep additional costs, my brother had breezily assured him that I had already reviewed the final numbers and fully approved the budget increase before I could even draft a response to Gavin. A second email arrived from the boutique rental company supplying the staging and linens. The account manager had attached a scanned photo of a preliminary confirmation slip for the upgraded lounge furniture. At the bottom of the slip, scrolled in blue ink, was the signature C. Robinson. I stared at the screen, my heart beating in a slow, heavy rhythm. The forgery was actually quite good. The loops and the slant were a decent approximation of my handwriting. Too busy vendor glancing at a piece of paper. It looked entirely legitimate, but to me, the hesitation marks in the ink were glaringly obvious. Owen had not just digitally copied my signature on the major addendums. He was actively forging my physical signature on the ground to push through immediate vanity-driven upgrades. I did not feel a sudden urge to scream, nor did I feel the need to call the police in that exact moment. Instead, I felt a profound sense of vindication. Naomi had been entirely right. I was not dealing with family members anymore. I was dealing with liabilities. I immediately typed a response to Gavin Holt. I kept my wording exceedingly polite and undeniably firm. I informed him that I had absolutely not approved a cigar lounge or garden sparklers. I explicitly stated that the signature on the rental slip was fraudulent and that I would not be assuming any financial responsibility for those items or any future additions. I thanked Gavin for his excellent service thus far and wished his team the best of luck with the event. I hit send, effectively closing the massive invisible vault door on my brother's unlimited funding. Next, I opened the master cloud directory where all the event planning files, guest lists, and seating charts were housed. I had built this entire digital infrastructure from scratch. With a few swift clicks, I opened the administrative panel and systematically revoked all access permissions. I removed Owen Sloan, Mallory, and my mother. I changed their status from editors to permanently locked out. I did not delete the files as they were now crucial evidence of my initial work and their subsequent fraud, but I severed their ability to view or manipulate the master plan. Finally, I logged into my secure banking portal. I navigated to the credit card management dashboard. Weeks ago, I had generated a temporary virtual credit card number linked to my main account specifically to handle minor incidental deposits for things like customized napkins and tasting fees. It was a convenience I had set up to keep the event expenses neatly organized. I clicked the button to report the virtual card as permanently compromised and watched the status instantly changed to frozen. I closed my laptop. I had not ruined their party. I had not canceled their venue or fired their caterer. I had simply stopped paying for the privilege of being abused. I had quietly, systematically closed every single door my family arrogantly assumed would remain open for them. I left the diner and drove back to my apartment. It was past 1:00 in the morning when I walked through my front door. The apartment was completely silent. I placed my keys on the counter and looked at my phone. There were no new messages. My parents and my brother were likely sleeping soundly, utterly convinced that my earlier silence was a sign of submission. They assumed I was sitting alone in the dark, crying over my exclusion, waiting for an opportunity to apologize and beg my way back into their good graces. Instead of going to my bedroom, I walked over to my home office and opened a heavy fireproof drawer. Inside was a leather-bound travel journal and a dedicated debit card linked to a high-yield savings account. For over 5 years, I had been quietly siphoning a small percentage of every paycheck into this specific fund. It was my escape hatch, a financial buffer I had built for the day I finally decided to prioritize my own peace over my family's endless crisis. I sat down at my desk, opened my personal laptop, and navigated to an airline booking portal. I did not search for cheap weekend getaways or quiet retreats in the mountains. I typed in the airport code for Honolulu, Arho. I selected a departure date for Saturday morning, the exact same day my brother was scheduled to stand in front of 200 wealthy guests and pretend to be a titan of industry. I chose a direct premium cabin seat. I paid for the ticket in full, the transaction clearing instantly. I spent the next hour moving methodically through my apartment. I pulled my sturdy hardshell suitcase from the top shelf of my closet. I packed lightweight clothing, a pair of good walking shoes, several swimsuits, and my noise-canceling headphones. I folded everything with meticulous precision, my mind entirely clear and incredibly calm. When everything was perfectly arranged inside, I closed the lid of the suitcase. I gripped the metal zipper and pulled it around the track. The sharp mechanical sound of the teeth locking together echoed loudly in the quiet room. It was the sound of absolute finality. For the first time in my entire adult life, I was leaving, and I was not asking a single person for their permission. By Friday morning, exactly 24 hours before the event, the carefully constructed illusion in Charleston began to fracture. I was in my bedroom, neatly folding a silk blouse into my hard-shell suitcase when the shock waves of my vendor emails finally reached the epicenter. My phone started vibrating across my nightstand in a relentless, angry rhythm. It was a chaotic symphony of incoming calls and text messages. I did not need to answer them to know exactly what was happening. Sloan and Owen had undoubtedly arrived at the venue for their final walkthrough, only to be met by a wall of highly professional, entirely unyielding vendor managers. The caterer, the lighting director, and the rental company were no longer operating on the vague promises of a Robinson family member because I had frozen the virtual card and formally revoked my status as the financial guarantor. All those expensive last-minute demands, the cigar lounge, the extra sparklers, the upgraded premium bar were suddenly demanding immediate hard currency. My mother was the first to leave a voicemail. When I played it back on speakerphone, her voice was completely devoid of maternal warmth. There was no apology for how I had been treated, no realization of the cruelty of my exclusion. Instead, she sounded like an irritated middle manager dealing with a rogue employee. She sharply demanded to know exactly where I had saved the original unedited vendor contracts. She ordered me to unlock the shared cloud directory immediately because Owen was standing in front of the venue coordinator and looking incredibly foolish. She ended the message by telling me to stop throwing a childish tantrum and fix the access permissions before I ruined the entire weekend. I deleted the voicemail with a single swipe of my thumb, but the sheer magnitude of their deception did not fully reveal itself until early that afternoon. The fatal error came from my younger cousin, Mallory. In her endless, desperate quest to prove her proximity to wealth and status, she posted a quick blurry video to her social media account. It was a behind-the-scenes shot of the rehearsal space. In the lower right corner of the frame, resting on a cocktail table, was a printed copy of the Master of Ceremonies script. I paused the video. I took a high-resolution screenshot and zoomed in on the glowing text. Most of the script was standard wedding banter, but one specific bolded paragraph halfway down the page made my breath catch in my throat. It was a cue for the Master of Ceremonies to pause the music, ask for the room's attention, and offer a very special acknowledgement of the Robinson family's profound generosity. The script directed the host to formally thank Claire Robinson for her incredible foundational gift to the happy couple. I stared at the words, "a foundational gift." It was a very specific, highly corporate phrasing. I immediately sent the screenshot to Naomi, who was already on high alert. I asked her to run a deep dive into Owen's recent digital footprint, specifically looking for any business filings or pitch decks he might have circulated in the last 2 months. It took Naomi less than 40 minutes to crack the vault. She called me back, and for the first time since I had known her, she sounded genuinely disgusted. She explained that she had managed to locate a private digital prospectus Owen had been quietly distributing to the wealthier, older guests on the Whittaker family's invitation list. The engagement party was not just a celebration of love. It was a heavily orchestrated soft-pitch investor event. Owen was launching a boutique hospitality management firm, an industry in which he had zero actual experience. To make himself look like a safe, lucrative bet to these millionaires, he needed a cornerstone investor to legitimize his operation. He had boldly listed my name alongside my corporate title of Senior Contracts Manager at North Briar Development Group as his lead angel investor. The prospectus explicitly stated that I was backing his new venture with a seed capital injection of $25,000. The gravity of the trap finally hit me with the force of a physical blow. The missing $22,500 from the Phantom Ivory Lantern studio invoice, combined with the mysterious upgrades, was not just about throwing the better party. It was a carefully designed mechanism to launder money through the event's budget directly into his new business account, all under the guise of my fabricated sponsorship. This was the exact reason they could not risk having me in the room. If I had attended the party, I would have been standing near the dance floor when the Master of Ceremonies grabbed the microphone. I would have heard my own name broadcast to 200 influential people, announcing a $25,000 financial commitment I knew absolutely nothing about. My presence would have forced me to either publicly scream the truth and destroy the event, or smile tightly and nod, effectively trapping myself in a massive non-consensual debt to avoid humiliating my family in front of high society. They had uninvited me to silence me, ensuring the lie could be sold without any immediate contradiction. My phone rang again. This time it was my father. Knowing what I knew now, I pressed the green button and lifted the receiver to my ear. Reed did not shout. He employed the soft, deeply manipulative tone he always used when a massive crisis was teetering on the edge of public exposure. He told me that Owen was under an immense amount of pressure. He casually admitted that there was a small minor announcement planned for the evening regarding Owen's business, but assured me it was merely a symbolic gesture to impress Sloane's father. My father's voice dropped lower, thick with calculated paternal pleading. He asked me to just call the venue back, reinstate my card for the incidentals, and allow the announcement to happen on paper. He promised with a smooth, practiced ease that they would handle everything internally afterward. He swore that no actual money would leave my account for the business. It was the final undeniable proof. He was openly asking me to become an active accomplice in defrauding his future in-laws, while simultaneously pushing me into a legal corner where I would be entirely responsible for the fallout if the lie collapsed. I did not argue. I did not tell him I had seen the prospectus. I simply told him I had to go, and I hung up the phone. By 6:00 the next morning, the sky over North Carolina was a dark, bruised purple. while the catering crews in Charleston were likely frantically arguing with Owen over missing deposits and locked files, I was quietly locking the front door of my apartment. I wheeled my suitcase down the silent hallway and stepped into the waiting ride-share car. The drive to the airport was incredibly peaceful. I watched the city lights blur past the window, thinking about my family. They were undoubtedly waking up in their expensive hotel suites right now, still clinging to the arrogant belief that I would eventually cave. They were absolutely certain that as the clock ticked closer to the evening reception, my lifelong conditioning would kick in. They thought I would log back into the portal, pay the invoices, and quietly absorb the $25,000 lie to save them from ruin. They had no idea that the safety net they had abused for a decade was currently printing a boarding pass for a direct flight to the Pacific Ocean. The terminal was bright, sterile, and perfectly anonymous. I cleared the security checkpoint with practiced efficiency and walked toward my designated gate. Through the massive glass windows, I could see the sleek silver body of the aircraft waiting on the tarmac, bathed in the early morning sunlight. The digital display above the desk flashed the final boarding call for Honolulu. I stopped near the boarding lane and pulled my phone from my pocket. The screen was completely filled with notifications. There were dozens of missed calls from Owen, frantic texts from my mother, and even a completely unhinged message from Sloan demanding to know why the floral archway was being actively disassembled by the vendor. The chaos had finally arrived. The massive fraudulent structure they had built on my back was beginning to collapse under its own weight. I looked at the glowing screen for one last long moment. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I pressed the power button, held it down until the screen went entirely black, and dropped the heavy device into the bottom of my travel tote. I handed my ticket to the gate agent, picked up my suitcase, and walked down the jet bridge. I stepped onto the flight feeling lighter than I had in years, exactly like a person who had just pulled the pin out of a live grenade that someone else was willingly hudding to their chest. Stepping off the 9-hour flight into the open-air terminal of Honolulu International Airport felt like walking into an entirely different dimension. The air was thick with the scent of plumerier and salt, and a warm trade wind immediately untangled the tight, defensive knots in my shoulders. The sun was a brilliant, blinding gold against the Pacific. It was a picture of absolute, untouchable tranquility. Exactly 4,000 m away on the humid, suffocating coast of South Carolina, the magnificent engagement party I had meticulously built was systematically tearing itself apart. The destruction did not happen in one massive explosion. It was a textbook cascade failure, a beautiful, agonizingly slow domino effect triggered by a single missing piece of paper, my authorized credit card. According to the frantic timelines Naomi would later piece together for me, the first crack appeared at exactly 4:00 in the afternoon. A luxury shuttle fleet, which I had explicitly refused to underwrite, arrived at the designated high-end hotels to transport the Whittaker family's esteemed guests. However, because the final balance had bounced hard against my frozen virtual account, the transportation company had ruthlessly cut the service in half. They sent exactly 3 vehicles instead of the contracted 6. A crowd of affluent, impeccably dressed guests, including Sloane's wealthy gray aunt, found themselves standing awkwardly on the hot pavement for over 40 minutes. They were eventually forced to hail standard, heavily used ride-share sedans, completely ruining the carefully curated VIP experience before they even reached the venue doors. When the frustrated guests finally arrived at the historic waterfront estate, the situation deteriorated further. They walked toward the grand courtyard, expecting the bespoke monogram signature cocktail bar that Mallory had so eagerly bragged about on social media. Instead, they found an empty wooden staging area. The boutique mixology vendor, having received an automated cancellation notice regarding the secondary guarantor, had simply never unloaded their truck. The premium imported liquors, the custom iced sculptures, and the specialized glacier were entirely gone. The venue was forced to quickly set up the basic uninspired table serving generic white wine and standard domestic beer. The old coastal money crowd, accustomed to the finest hospitality, exchanged sharp, whispering glances. The atmosphere inside the main ballroom was supposed to be saved by a sprawling 9-piece live jazz ensemble. Owen, in his endless arrogance, had bypassed my original contract and demanded a larger horn section and an additional 2 hours of performance time, assuring the band leader that his wealthy sister would handle the upgraded invoice upon arrival. When the band leader sought out the event coordinator to collect the mandated pre-performance payment, the coordinator could only present a rejected authorization code. Refusing to work for empty promises, the musicians quietly packed up their brass instruments, rolled up their microphone cables, and walked out the back service doors. The cavernous, beautifully draped ballroom was left echoing with a generic looping playlist piped through the venue's standard ceiling speakers. Then came the sheer, terrifying physical reality of the guest list. I had painstakingly negotiated a strict non-negotiable maximum capacity of 150 people with the fire marshal. It was the only way to secure the discounted rate for the space. Owen and Sloan, entirely disregarding the legal contract, had mailed out over 220 invitations, assuming I would simply bribe the security team or pay the massive overage fines on the night of the event. Gavin Hall, the meticulous venue manager whom I had formerly warned the night before, did not play those games. When the head count hit 150, his security team physically locked the glass doors to the scenic rooftop terrace. Dozens of angry, bewildered guests were trapped in the lower holding lounge, their expensive silk dresses clinging to them in the cramped rising heat. Amidst this logistical nightmare, the two crucial venture capital investors, the wealthy men Owen had specifically invited to secure funding for his phantom boutique hospitality firm, were standing near the barren bar. They were holding the glossy and heavily embellished pitch brochures that prominently listed my name as the lead financial backer. They began asking pointed, uncomfortable questions. If Claire Robinson was injecting $25,000 into this brilliant new business, why was she conspicuously absent from the family table? And more pressingly, if the Robinson family was so financially robust, why were the guests drinking cheap wine out of standard glass tumblers while listening to a recorded playlist? The final fatal blow was delivered by Gavin Holt himself. Just before the welcome toasts were scheduled to begin, Gavin intercepted the master of ceremonies near the audio booth. He had read the script. He saw the mandated announcement thanking me for a foundational corporate gift protecting the venue from any implication of financial fraud. Gavin issued a severe, non-negotiable ultimatum. He told Owen straight to his face that if the MC uttered a single word about a financial sponsorship tied to my name without my direct, legally binding consent, he would personally cut the power to the microphone and shut the entire reception down. The pressure cooker finally burst, driven into a corner by the collapsing logistics and the furious whispers of the Whittaker family. Owen and Sloan turned on each other. They dragged one another into a narrow, dimly lit service hallway located right behind the main catering kitchen, desperately believing they were out of earshot. They were wrong. A guest, ostensibly searching for the restrooms, caught the entire explosive confrontation on their cell phone camera. In the raw, unedited footage that would soon circulate through every social circle in Charleston, Sloane's perfectly manicured facade was completely obliterated. She was sobbing hysterically, her voice echoing off the tile walls, screaming that Owen had sworn his older sister would sign for absolutely everything. She yelled that he was a fraud who was currently humiliating her in front of her entire bloodline. Owen, his face flushed dark red with panic and rage, threw the blame violently back at her. He shouted that she was the one who had forced him to kick me out of the wedding. He screamed that her obsessive elitist need to curate the photographs had severed their only lifeline to the money and that she was directly responsible for the fact that they were currently drowning in unpaid bills. Thousands of miles away, I sat down on the warm powdery sand of Wiki Beach. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long, brilliant streaks of violet and burnt orange across the horizon. I reached into my canvas-tote bag and pulled out my phone. I pressed the power button, just wanting to check the local Hawaiian time. The second the device connected to a cell tower, it effectively exploded in my hand. The screen lit up with an absolutely relentless cascading waterfall of notifications. There were 18 missed calls from my mother, 12 from my father, 27 from Owen. There were frantic text messages from Sloane's bridesmaids. There were angry automated alerts from the rental companies regarding breached contracts. Then came the chilling singular texts from my father. They were no longer manipulative or demanding. They were laced with pure, unadulterated terror. They read that I needed to pick up right now. They demanded to know where I was. They ordered me to call back immediately because there was a massive legal issue. I held the vibrating piece of glass and metal in my palm. I watched the names of my family members flash across the screen in a desperate, endless loop for a decade. That flashing screen had been a leash. It had been a siren pulling me away from my own life to extinguish their self-inflicted fires. Every single time they panicked, I had answered. I had always smoothed the rough edges, paid the overdue balances, and absorbed their collateral damage in silence. Not today. I looked out at the vast rhythmic rolling of the Pacific Ocean. The water was incredibly loud, a beautiful, steady roar that completely drowned out the tiny, desperate vibrations in my hand. I did not type a reply. I did not send a voice memo explaining my location. For the first time in my 34 years of existence, I let my absolute, unbroken silence speak infinitely louder than their frantic, chaotic noise. I switched the phone back to airplane mode, slipped it into my bag, and watched the sun dip below the water. I checked into a small, unassuming boutique hotel perched right on the edge of the water. My room was not a sprawling luxury suite, but it had a heavy wooden balcony that jutted out toward the ocean. For the first time in over 8 months, the rhythm of my morning was not dictated by the sharp synthetic ping of a calendar notification or the vibration of a crisis call from the East Coast. Instead, the loudest sound in my world was the steady, rhythmic crashing of the Pacific waves against the sea wall. It was deafening in the most beautiful, healing way possible. I spent my first 2 days completely untethered. I walked for miles barefoot along the damp, packed sand of the shoreline. I ate fresh seafood alone at tiny, vibrant corner cafes, tasting my food instead of just swallowing it while reviewing legal addendums. I bought a cheap unlined notebook from a local pharmacy and sat under the shade of a banyan tree, writing down every single thought that came into my head. I actively forced myself to ignore the dark screen of my phone, which I had buried deep inside my travel bag. I knew the notifications were piling up like a digital avalanche. I knew my mother was likely leaving voice notes filled with that familiar commanding tone, ordering me to fix a mess I had not created. But here, surrounded by the vastness of the ocean, the gravitational pull of my family's dysfunction felt incredibly weak. The absolute peace of the island served as a harsh, illuminating contrast to the life I had left behind in North Carolina in the Robinson household. My competence had entirely erased my humanity. Every choice I made had been seamlessly converted into a family obligation. If I saved money, it was expected to be a safety net for my brother. If I possessed negotiation skills, I was required to deploy them for his social climbing. My own emotions, my fatigue, and my boundaries were always treated as an inconvenient nuisance by my parents. Standing in the warm Hawaiian surf, breathing in the clean air, I realized how deeply exhausted I was from carrying the weight of 4 grown adults. The bubble of isolation, however, could not last forever. The real world was bleeding through the cracks. On the evening of my 3rd day, I finally connected my laptop to the hotel wireless network to check my personal email. The very first message in my inbox was from Naomi. The subject line was blank, but the body contained a single, highly compressed video file and a brief note stating that the furlough had officially breached containment. I clicked play. It was the footage of Owen and Sloan screaming at each other in the dim service hallway of the Charleston venue. It was chaotic and raw. I watched my brother's face contort with panic as he blamed me for their financial ruin, and I listened to his fiancée shriek about the humiliating destruction of her perfect aesthetic. Naomi's follow-up message explained that a prominent guest with deep ties to the local social registry had recorded the fight and immediately shared it in a private group chat. From there it had spread like wildfire. The entire coastal elite circle now knew that the opulent Robinson empire was nothing but a hollow shell. While the social humiliation was profound, the actual life-altering danger arrived 10 minutes later. A new email appeared bypassing my junk filter. It was not from a disgruntled vendor or an angry relative. It was from Arthur Vance, one of the 2 high-net-worth angel investors Owen had desperately tried to court at the party. Arthur was a ruthless, pragmatic venture capitalist who did not tolerate games. His email was chillingly brief and devastatingly direct. He wrote that he had reviewed the printed prospectus for the new boutique hospitality group. He noted that my name and corporate title were prominently featured as the lead financial backer, pledging $25,000 in seed capital. Arthur calmly stated that given the highly irregular nature of the engagement event, the sudden cancellation of premium services, and my glaring absence, he was requesting a direct personal confirmation from me regarding my involvement. He asked point blank if I was truly underwriting this venture or if my professional credentials were being used without my consent. My stomach dropped. This was no longer just a messy family dispute over a wedding seating chart or unpaid catering bills. Owen had crossed a massive legal boundary. He was using my active corporate title at North Briar Development Group to solicit major funding under false pretenses. If this blew up into a formal fraud investigation, my own career, the reputation I had spent 10 years building from the ground up, could be dragged down into the mud with him. Before I could even process Arthur's email, my secure messaging application chimed. It was Gavin Hall, the venue manager back in Charleston. Gavin was not reaching out to demand money. The venue had already kept the initial deposits and rightfully frozen out the unpaid upgrades. Gavin was contacting me as a professional courtesy. He explained that several vendors were preparing to file small claims lawsuits against the primary contract holder, which unfortunately still bore the Robinson name. He asked if I wanted to submit a formal written declaration to the venue's legal department, explicitly stating that all financial commitments, forged signatures, and secondary guarantees made under my identity for the event upgrades were completely unauthorized and fraudulent. I sat perfectly still on the wooden balcony, the screen glowing against the darkening Hawaiian sky. I was standing at the most critical crossroads of my entire life. If I remained silent and simply ignored Arthur and Gavin, the legal ambiguity might give my family just enough room to spin a lie. My father would likely leverage his retirement savings to quietly pay off the angry vendors. They would tell the investors that I had simply pulled out of the deal at the last minute due to a sudden illness. They would patch the holes, cover the tracks, and eventually a year from now, they would expect me to show up at Thanksgiving dinner and play my designated role as if nothing had ever happened. But if I spoke up, if I put the truth in writing and sent it to an investor and a corporate legal department, I would be driving the final nail into the coffin. I would be formally exposing my brother as a fraud. I would be protecting myself completely and absolutely, but I would permanently destroy the illusion of the Robinson family. There would be no coming back from that. My parents would never forgive me for prioritizing my own survival over their golden son's reputation. I closed my eyes and listened to the ocean. I thought about the forged signature. I thought about the $25,000 lie printed on glossy card stock. I thought about my mother telling me to grow up and take the insult quietly. I opened my eyes. The decision was already made. I did not owe them my silence anymore. I had paid my dues for a decade. The only person I owed anything to was the woman sitting on this balcony. I opened a new blank document. I drafted 2 distinct, highly precise emails. The first was to Arthur Vance. I thanked him for reaching out. I stated clearly in unambiguous professional language that I had absolutely zero knowledge of the boutique hospitality venture. I confirmed that I had never pledged $25,000, nor had I authorized the use of my name, signature, or corporate title in any investment prospectus related to Owen Robinson. I advised him to consider any document bearing my signature regarding that business to be entirely fraudulent. The second email was to Gavin Hall and the venue's legal team. I attached the findings Naomi had gathered regarding the copied digital metadata. I formally declared that any financial guarantee, addendum, or upgrade contract presented after my initial withdrawal was forged. I officially completely severed myself from all liability. I read both emails 3 times to ensure there was no emotion, no anger, and no hesitation in the text. It was just cold, hard, undeniable fact. I hit send on the first. Then I hit send on the second. I closed my laptop, leaned my head back against the chair, and let out a long, shuddering breath. The heavy, suffocating chain that had been wrapped around my chest for 34 years finally snapped in half. I was entirely free. The balmy Hawaiian air flowing through the open balcony doors felt entirely at odds with the cold, hard data scrolling endlessly across my screen. Naomi and I had established a secure encrypted video link bridging the 6 time zones between Honolulu and Charlotte. We were no longer simply looking at the petty aftermath of a cancelled wedding invitation. We were actively mapping the architecture of a deliberate, highly coordinated financial crime. We spent the next 48 hours meticulously cataloging the digital debris left behind in the master event folder. While I had locked my family out of the Active Directory, I still possessed the administrative audit logs. Every single keystroke, every downloaded file, and every modified timestamp was laid bare before us. We tracked the exact IP addresses and account names that had accessed the shared drive in the days leading up to my exile. We established a rock-solid chain of custody for the digital signatures, definitively proving they were applied for my brother's primary laptop. But the most damning revelation emerged when I turned my full attention to the phantom vendor that had initially blown the lid off the entire operation. I stared at the line item for $22,500. Naomi, utilizing her extensive corporate auditing tools, ran a deep background check on the limited liability corporation listed on that bloated invoice. It took her less than an hour to pierce the corporate veil. Ivory Lantern Studio was not a highly sought-after exclusive design firm catering to the coastal elite. It was a flimsy shell company registered exactly 5 weeks ago to a standard residential address. The registered agent on the incorporation papers was a man I recognized instantly. It was an old college roommate of my brother, a man who had famously failed out of his business program. Even more devastating was the name listed as the secondary managing officer. It was Sloan's younger cousin. The mechanics of their embezzlement scheme became terrifyingly clear. We cross-referenced the itemized list on the Ivory Lantern invoice with the contracts of the legitimate established vendors I had personally hired. They were actively billing the event for custom silk ceiling draping and imported amber uplighting. Those were the exact same items I had already secured, negotiated, and paid the initial deposits for through the venue's exclusive in-house design team. It was a textbook double billing operation. My brother and his fiancée were intentionally inflating the overall budget with duplicate phantom services. They used my forged signature to authorize the payout of those funds, entirely planning to siphon the cash directly into a newly opened bank account controlled by their friends and family. The extravagant engagement party was nothing more than an elaborate money-laundering front to quietly fund his fabricated hospitality startup, and they had intended to use my pristine credit line to finance the entire heist. Just as the sheer scale of the financial rot settled in my chest, a new piece of evidence arrived that shattered whatever lingering emotional detachment I had managed to build. It was an audio file forwarded to me by one of my few loyal acquaintances in Charleston, a woman who had attended the disastrous reception and noticed the glaring discrepancies. She had discreetly recorded a conversation happening near the empty, unstocked bar. I put on my noise-canceling headphones and pressed play. Over the faint, generic background music piping through the venue speakers, I heard my brother's unmistakable voice. He was speaking to an older, distinguished gentleman who was likely one of the targeted venture capitalists. The man politely asked why the esteemed lead investor, Claire Robinson, was absent from such a momentous family occasion. I listened to my brother let out a heavy, perfectly practiced sigh. He lowered his voice into a tone of deep, compassionate sorrow. He told the man that I had recently suffered a severe, debilitating mental breakdown. He claimed I was deeply unstable, entirely incapable of handling basic professional stress, and that the family had been forced to quietly send me away to a psychiatric retreat in the Pacific to recover. He painted a masterful picture of himself as the long-suffering, fiercely protective brother, desperately trying to shield a deranged, unpredictable sister from public scrutiny. My hands gripped the edge of the desk so tightly my knuckles turned white. They had not just uninvited me. They had not just attempted to steal my money. They had preemptively, viciously assassinated my character, by officially branding me as mentally unstable to a room full of influential people. They ensured that if I ever tried to speak the truth about the fraud, I would be instantly dismissed as a hysterical, delusional woman seeking revenge. It was a flawless, sociopathic masterclass in gaslighting. It turned my deliberate exclusion from a social insult into a calculated mechanism for total discreditation. The final fatal blow to any remaining illusion of family loyalty came from an internal email thread Naomi unearthed from the venue's communication portal. It was a forwarded message chain between Owen Sloan and my mother. The timestamp was exactly 2 days before the party. My mother, the woman who had demanded I grow up and stop ruining her son's big day, had written a direct reply regarding the timeline of the evening reception. Her exact words glowed bright white against the dark screen of my monitor. She strictly instructed Owen to ensure that the security team at the front gate was given a non-negotiable directive. She wrote that under absolutely no circumstances should Claire be allowed into the building until the foundational funding announcement was completely finished and the investors had signed the preliminary letters of intent. My mother knew everything. She knew about the fake investment prospectus. She knew about the stolen money. And instead of stopping it, she actively helped them build the physical firewall to keep me out of the room while they robbed me blind. I stared at the neatly organized digital folders sitting on my desktop. The urge to take every single screenshot, every audio file, the metadata logs, and the fraudulent shell company invoices and blast them across every single social media platform was incredibly strong. I could utterly destroy their social standing in the court of public opinion within 60 seconds. But I am a professional risk manager. I do not deal in messy, emotional public spectacles that can be debated in comment sections. I deal in airtight, undeniable, legally devastating ruin. If I posted the evidence online, they would spin it. They would lean heavily into the mental breakdown narrative they had already planted. They would claim the documents were fabricated by a jealous, unhinged sister. I needed a strike so precise, so legally terrifying, and so public in the right circles that not a single member of my family or their affluent new-in-laws could ever twist the narrative. I closed the encrypted drive and safely ejected it from the port. I packed my laptop into my carry-on bag. The peaceful sanctuary of the Hawaiian island had served its ultimate purpose. It had given me the quiet space required to see the entire chessboard rather than just the isolated pieces they wanted me to see. I reached for my phone, turned off the airplane mode, and completely ignored the hundreds of frantic, unread notifications still pouring in from the East Coast. I opened the airline application and booked a premium one-way ticket back to North Carolina for the very next morning. I was not flying back to seek closure. I was not going back to cry, to demand an empty apology, or to help them fix the shattered remains of their reputation. I was returning to look them directly in the eyes as I locked the doors of the trap they had so carefully built for me, with all of them still inside. The flight from Honolulu back to Charlotte was a blur of altitude and cold, recycled cabin air. When I finally pulled my rental car into the sweeping tree-lined driveway of my parents' estate in North Carolina, the heavy humidity of the South felt like a physical weight settling onto my shoulders. I parked behind my father's pristine luxury sedan and turned off the engine. I sat in the silence for a long moment, bracing myself for the psychological theater I was about to endure. When I pushed open the heavy oak front door, I was immediately struck by how utterly alien my childhood home felt. The atmosphere was completely suffocating, thick with the scent of lemon furniture polish and freshly brewed Earl Grey tea. The house was immaculate. Every faux pillow on the cream-colored sofa was perfectly fluffed. Every silver picture frame on the mantel was gleaming, and a delicate porcelain tea service was arranged with geometric precision on the low mahogany coffee table. It was a masterfully staged set piece. They had meticulously constructed the aesthetic of a highly civilized, deeply rational family discussion. They were trying to domesticate the massive, raging fire of their own fraud by serving it with hot water and lemon wedges. My mother, Elaine, was the first to speak as I stepped into the living room. She was sitting rigidly on the edge of an armchair, dabbing at the corners of her eyes with a monogram tissue. She did not yell, and she did not immediately demand my compliance as she had on the voicemails. Instead, she leaned into a practiced, fragile weeping. She told me in a trembling voice that things had simply spiraled out of control. She claimed the pressure of marrying into the Whittaker family had been an unbearable, crushing weight on all of them, and that the brutal expectations of high society had caused them to make a few regrettable, desperate missteps. In her mind, they were not architects of a financial crime. They were merely victims of incredibly stressful wedding planning who had gotten slightly carried away. Owen was slumped on the far end of the sofa, looking entirely stripped of his usual golden boy charisma. His skin was pale, his eyes were bloodshot from a severe lack of sleep, and his designer shirt was wrinkled at the collar. He looked physically ill, yet he could not bring himself to offer a single genuine word of apology. When he finally opened his mouth, he spoke entirely in evasive corporate jargon. He told me it was a highly fluid situation. He muttered that it was a sudden liquidity emergency, that he had been completely cornered by the vendors, and that he honestly had no other choice but to leverage my name temporarily to keep the entire operation afloat. He desperately avoided using words like forgery, theft, or embezzlement. I walked over to the single empty chair opposite them and sat down. I did not cross my arms, and I did not glare. I simply rested my hands in my lap and looked at them with a mild, terrifyingly blank expression. I did not interrupt their excuses. I did not launch into a furious tirade about the stolen money, the fake investment prospectus, or the vicious voicemail where Owen had branded mentally unstable. My absolute silence acted like a vacuum in the room, sucking all the oxygen out of their rehearsed apologies. They had prepared for a screaming match. They had geared up to defend themselves against an angry, emotional sister. They had absolutely no defense against a woman who simply sat there sipping a cup of lukewarm tea, watching them squirm like biological specimens under a microscope. The quiet stretched on for several agonizing minutes until my father Reed finally cracked. He cleared his throat loudly, abandoning the soft, conciliatory tone, and shifted into his familiar role as the pragmatic patriarch trying to close a messy business deal. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and laid the grim reality out on the table. He admitted that 2 of the major vendors were actively drafting breach of contract lawsuits because the final invoices remained unpaid. Furthermore, the whispers within the Whittaker family social circle had reached a fever pitch. Sloane's father was demanding to see the hard financial data behind Owen's new boutique hospitality venture before he allowed his daughter to be permanently associated with a public embarrassment. My father looked me dead in the eye and delivered his final pitch. He said the entire disaster could be swept under the rug with a few simple strokes of a pen. He had brought printed copies of the vendor addendums and the investment pledges. All I had to do was sign a series of retroactive confirmations, legally stating that I had eventually authorized the late additions and the business sponsorship. He promised he would liquidate a portion of his own retirement portfolio by the end of the fiscal quarter to pay off the immediate vendor debt. He just needed my signature right now to stop the lawsuits and validate the lie to the investors. Then came the twisted, pathetic revelation that truly highlighted the absurdity of their world. Reed informed me that Sloane had not actually broken off the engagement. She was currently staying at her parents' coastal estate, waiting in the wings. She had sent Owen a clear message if the Robinson family could successfully extinguish the scandal, bury the financial discrepancies, and preserve the illusion of the $25,000 angel investment before the rumors permanently tainted her social standing, she would agree to resume the wedding planning. They were literally asking me to legally bind myself to a fraudulent debt so my brother could buy back a woman who only loved his fabricated net worth. I looked from my father's desperate face to my brother's hollow eyes and finally to my mother's tear-stained cheeks. I took a slow, deep breath, perfectly mimicking the hesitation of a woman whose resolve was finally breaking under the heavy, crushing weight of familial loyalty. I set my teacup down on the saucer with a soft clink. I kept my voice incredibly low and calm. I told them that I heard everything they were saying and I understood the severe gravity of the situation. I said that if I was going to put my name on retroactive legal documents of this magnitude, I absolutely refused to do it on a coffee table in a living room. I told them I needed to review the exact figures in a professional setting to ensure the boundaries were clear and that the financial damage was truly contained. I suggested we meet the following morning at 10:00 sharp. I gave them the address of a neutral, highly reputable corporate mediation office located in the downtown financial district. I said we would lay all the paperwork out on a conference table, finalize the numbers, and wrap the entire nightmare up cleanly. The collected sigh of relief that swept through the living room was palpable. My mother closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks. My father nodded vigorously, his posture instantly relaxing as he praised my maturity and my willingness to protect the family name. Owen finally looked up, a weak, pathetic smile forming on his lips, entirely convinced that his quiet, reliable workhorse of a sister had finally returned to the harness. I stood up, smoothed the front of my slacks, and walked out the front door without another word. They had absolutely no idea at the moment I pulled out of their driveway. I drove straight to the sleek glass-paneled building where my newly retained civil litigator was waiting. Naomi was already there, sitting in a private conference room surrounded by thick black leather binders. We spent the next 6 hours meticulously organizing the kill shot. We printed the metadata logs highlighting the exact hour and minute the digital signatures were stolen. We printed the shell company incorporation papers linking the phantom vendor to Sloane's cousin. We transcribed the voicemail where Owen had lied about my mental health to the investors. My attorney, a sharp, unyielding woman named Evelyn, took the final crucial steps. Under the guise of a formal settlement discussion regarding the outstanding vendor debts, she quietly reached out and secured the attendance of two very specific guests for tomorrow's meeting. The first was Gavin Holt, the venue manager holding the forged physical rental slips. The second was Arthur Vance, the venture capitalist who had directly received the fraudulent investment prospectus. As I drove back to my own apartment late that evening, the city lights reflecting off my windshield, my heart beat with a steady, powerful rhythm. The Robinson family was going to sleep peacefully tonight, entirely blinded by their own arrogance. They thought they had successfully reeled me back into their toxic orbit to absorb their impact. They thought they were walking into a quiet, private room tomorrow morning to save their hollow empire. They had no idea they were walking directly into an inescapable, meticulously documented execution. The conference room in the downtown financial district was walled entirely in heavy frosted glass, creating an atmosphere that was both brilliantly illuminated and completely inescapable. At exactly 10:00 in the morning, the heavy wooden door swung open. My parents, Reed and Elaine, walked in first, followed closely by my brother Owen. They carried themselves with the relaxed, deeply arrogant posture of people who firmly believed they had already won. My father even had a sleek silver fountain pen clipped to his breast pocket, fully prepared to hand it to me, so I could blindly sign away my financial freedom and save their tarnished reputation. Their smug expressions evaporated the exact second they stepped past the threshold and realized we were not alone. I was seated at the far end of a long mahogany table. To my immediate right sat Evelyn, my newly retained civil litigation attorney, who was currently organizing a stack of thick manila folders. To my left sat Naomi, her tablet already awake and connected to the room's main presentation monitor. But it was the presence of the two men sitting on the opposite side of the table that completely paralyzed my family. Gavin Holt, the senior events director from the Charleston venue, sat with his hands neatly folded over a leather portfolio. Next to him, looking impeccably dressed and visibly furious, was Arthur Vance, the prominent venture capitalist Owen had attempted to defraud. Owen stopped dead in his tracks. All the color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly translucent shade of gray. My mother gasped softly, her hand flying to her throat, while my father instinctively took a half step backward, his eyes darting frantically toward the exit. I did not offer them a seat, and I did not offer them a warm greeting. I looked directly at my father and delivered my opening statement. I kept my voice entirely devoid of emotion, stripping away decades of complex family history until only the cold, hard facts remained. I told them I was not here to debate who loved whom, nor was I here to listen to any more fabricated excuses about wedding pressure. I stated clearly that the sole purpose of this meeting was to formally establish exactly who had stolen my name, forged my signature, and weaponized my professional reputation to underwrite a series of fraudulent commitments. Evelyn, my attorney, smoothly took over. She nodded toward Gavin Hall, who opened his portfolio and slid a stack of photocopied rental slips across the polished wood. Gavin did not mince words. He detailed the specific timeline of the forged addendums, pointing directly to the fraudulent signatures authorizing the cigar lounge, the pyrotechnics, and the premium transportation. He informed my family that the venue had officially frozen all associated accounts and that their corporate legal department was actively preparing to file criminal fraud charges against the primary contract holder if the responsible party did not immediately confess. Before my father could even open his mouth to offer a desperate mitigating excuse, Naomi tapped the screen of her tablet. The massive monitor mounted on the wall instantly lit up. She walked the room through the undeniable digital forensic evidence. She displayed the metadata log side by side, proving without a shadow of a doubt that the digital signature had been illegally extracted from an old tax document and pasted onto the new vendor contracts. Then she pulled up the corporate registration records for the phantom vendor, Ivory Lantern Studio. She cleanly highlighted the names of the registered agents, publicly exposing the shell company as a direct mechanism created by Owen and Sloane's cousin to siphon money out of the wedding budget. The door to the conference room suddenly opened again. It was Sloane. Evelyn had purposefully arranged for her to arrive 15 minutes late, leading her to believe she was walking into a private, intimate family reconciliation. Sloane marched into the room wearing a designer linen suit, a rehearsed look of mild aristocratic annoyance on her face when she saw Arthur Vance and Gavin Holt staring back at her. Her eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated panic. I did not give her a chance to speak. I reached for my phone, connected it to the room's audio system, and played my final devastating piece of evidence. It was a forwarded voice memo Naomi had extracted from the internal Azad servers. My mother's sharp, commanding voice suddenly echoed off the glass walls. The recording captured Elaine explicitly ordering Owen to lock down the venue's front gate and ensure I was kept physically out of the building until the foundational funding announcement was completely finished. The audio proved definitively that my cruel exclusion from the guest list was never about my aesthetic not fitting in with the bridal party. It was a highly calculated preemptive strike orchestrated by my own mother to ensure I could not disrupt the $25,000 lie they were selling to the investors. The room erupted into a beautiful destructive chaos. Sloane, realizing her pristine social image was about to be obliterated by a massive corporate fraud scandal, instantly turned on the man she was supposed to marry. She pointed a trembling finger at Owen and began screaming that she had absolutely no knowledge of the shell company, desperately trying to throw him under the bus to save herself. Arthur Vance stood up. The venture capitalist looked at Owen with an expression of pure unfiltered disgust. He calmly adjusted his suit jacket and announced that any possibility of securing capital from his firm or any firm within his extensive coastal network was permanently dead. He promised Owen that if a single document bearing my forged name ever circulated in the financial sector again, he would personally ensure my brother faced federal wire fraud charges. Arthur did not wait for a response. He simply turned on his heel and walked out of the room. But the most spectacular collapse belonged to my father. Reed had spent his entire life fiercely protecting his son, constantly bailing him out and demanding that I absorb the damage. As he desperately scanned the printed contracts Naomi had laid on the table, trying to assess the immediate financial ruin, his eyes locked onto a specific clause hidden deep in the venue's secondary liability addendum. Owen had been arrogant, but he had also been incredibly reckless. When the initial attempts to charge my frozen virtual card had failed, Owen had panicked. Needing a backup guarantor to keep the facade alive for just a few more hours, he had forged a second signature. Reed stared in absolute horror at the bottom of the page, realizing that his own son had secretly listed Reed's personal retirement account as the ultimate collateral for the unpaid luxury upgrades. The man who had spent a decade enabling the monster had finally been dragged down into the very pit he had helped dig. Evelyn slid a single, legally binding affidavit across the table toward me. It was a sworn statement completely severing me from the Robinson family's financial liabilities, declaring all previous signatures null and void. I picked up my own pen, signed my real, undeniable signature at the bottom, and handed it back to my attorney. My mother was sobbing openly into her hands. Owen was staring blankly at the mahogany table, his entire fabricated universe reduced to ash. My father looked like he had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. I stood up, pushed my chair back, and looked at them one last time. I refused to sign a single retroactive paper to save them. I accepted that this moment meant complete permanent estrangement from my blood relatives, and I realized it was the cheapest price I could possibly pay to finally get my own life back. I walked out of the glass room and never looked back. Many months later, the dust had completely settled. The crisis management skills I had honed during that brutal week did not go unnoticed by the executive board at Northbria Development Group. I was heavily promoted to the position of Director of Risk Mitigation. Using my newly elevated platform, I eventually branched out and opened my own highly successful consulting firm, specifically dedicated to rescuing massive corporate projects from the exact type of contractual fraud my brother had attempted. I returned to Hawaii the following winter, not to escape a nightmare, but simply to enjoy the life I had built with my own two hands. I was walking along the pristine shoreline of Oahu, the warm Pacific water washing over my feet, when my phone began to ring. I did not feel that familiar, suffocating dread. I pulled the device from my pocket and smiled at the glowing screen. It was not a desperate, manipulative call from a ruined family demanding I clean up their mess. It was a call from a high-tier corporate client, someone who genuinely understood my worth, calling to ask for my professional guidance. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please leave a comment down below letting me know where in the world you are tuning in from so we can connect and share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe to the Azad Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people. Thanks.